Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all, and welcome to the show. It's another edition of Office Hours, the 12th edition. It's a special spooky Halloween edition. It's also Game 6 of the World Series. We will conclude before the start of the game, so don't worry, listeners and watchers. You will have a chance to see, hopefully, Toronto defeat LA and win the World Series. I have to say that as a Canadian, now it's my patriotic duty to support the Blue Jays. But as a former Bay Area resident, where I really call home, anytime you can beat LA, it is, of course, joyous. So, but we're here really to talk about what I think will be a really timely, topical, set of issues, and also something that might be both very difficult to think about in terms of how awful and horrific, but also in a way kind of fun, which is in fact actually what I take the horror genre sometimes to be able to do, is to raise interesting issues about our fears and terrors that we experience in the world, but distance us from them to be able to think about them and engage them, in a different way. And to discuss this topic of horror, fact, and fiction in an era of genocide, and to talk about the ghosts and the specters that are haunting the world, I have a fantastic and wonderful guest, a good friend, colleague, and comrade, Professor David Schmid from the State University of New York in Buffalo. I'll just tell people if they can look at the description to find out more details, but he is the author of Natural Born Celebrities, Serial Killers in American Culture, and a co-editor or editor of a number of very interesting collections that are relevant to this topic: Zombie Talk, Culture, History, Politics, Violence in American Popular Culture, Globalization and the State in Contemporary Crime Fiction. And so we are lucky to have a professor of English who pays attention to these genres and conventions of crime fiction on one hand, horror and zombie, kind of culture and production, film, and so on. And I understand is currently teaching a horror film class. So this is so relevant. Thank you so much, David, for joining Office Hours. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's wonderful to see you again.
It's great to be here, Adnan. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, there are so many places one could start, and I think we'll talk about some specific, films, and you had made some suggestions that I linked in social media and in the description for this video. Maybe some of our listeners and watchers got a chance to read them and consult them, so we may talk about a number of different components and aspects of the horror genre, but I thought it might be worthwhile, even if people find themselves familiar, because they may have watched lots of horror films, may have read horror stories and horror fiction, and so on, if maybe you might tell us a little bit about the literary and cultural history of horror and why it's been such a long-lasting genre in some ways. People like to be scared and frightened. That seems a curious thing. It's not a pleasant experience, but yet this is a feature of the genre. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about horror fiction.
Sure, absolutely. Before I do that, I just wanted to take this opportunity for myself, but also on behalf of your other listeners, to thank you for all of the content you've been putting out over the past few months. And these times in particular, it's so important, the work that you're doing in terms of giving us a kind of a ray of hope, building a community. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for doing that before I do anything else.
Oh, that's so kind of you. And, listeners and watchers, I did not put Professor David Schmid up to that. But it's so kind of you to say. At any rate, the best part of it is the community. And I see many people in the chat already who I recognize from previous streams. So there is a community being formed. And I'm so glad to welcome you into it, because You've been in the chat occasionally and expressed interesting comments, but now we get to talk about an area of your great expertise. So take it away.
Well, yeah, I think if you're looking for the origins of the horror genre and horror literature, you have to go a very, very long way back. It has its roots in religion and mythology, with the adaptation of folkloric figures that took on various forms, including vampires, werewolves, demons, so on and so forth. And in that respect, this is something we can perhaps talk about later. It's interesting that if you look at more contemporary horror films in countries like Indonesia, Japan, India, you can see that things have come full circle. Turkey would be another example of this development, in as much as a lot of the horror content from those countries is bringing back those folkloric figures such as the jinn and using them to as the basis for more contemporary horror films. But I think in terms of horror literature in particular, where it becomes more recognizable to most of us is when we get to the Gothic period in the 18th century. And we're talking about novels like The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe and The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. And then we move from there to the sort of 19th century and figures that are even more familiar to us, such as Edgar Allan Poe. And Poe obviously casts a long shadow, and there are still people writing today who are very much influenced by his work. And today, I would say that horror as a culture, as a cultural phenomenon, is not only more popular than ever, but more diverse than ever. It covers a wider range of media. You can find it across the globe to an extent that's unprecedented. And I think there are several reasons for this. One very popular interpretation, well, let me just back up a little bit. I have a quote that I'm very fond of from the Roman playwright Terence, who says, "I am human, therefore nothing human is alien to me." And what I take that to mean in this context is that, to some extent, being curious about the extremes of human behavior and about the horrific is a completely natural part of what it means to be human. So there's nothing necessarily deviant about being interested in this subject. But another very popular reason for why people are interested has to do with escapism. That horror gives us the opportunity to escape from the real world that may be, and often is, even more horrific. So for example, if you look at the cycle of so-called monster movies that started to appear in Hollywood in the early 1930s, so we're talking about Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, etc. It's been often argued at the time and since that the popularity of these films is connected to the Great Depression and the widespread economic misery that was being experienced by millions of people at the time, and going to the movie theater and watching these films about the supernatural was just an opportunity to forget about the real world and to indulge yourself in visions of another world completely. I'm not going to dismiss that argument completely, but what I would say is that the fundamental appeal of the horror genre is that it allows us to engage with our world. It allows us to process and to understand both events, phenomena in our world, and our own position in it. And I think in that respect, I would compare what a lot of horror media does to what Frederick Jameson describes in a very different context as cognitive mapping. Horror gives us an opportunity to understand the world around us and to understand a little bit about our own place within that world. And the reason for that, the reason horror is able to do that, is because it has an almost unparalleled ability to engage with and to track the social, cultural, political issues of our time. And one of the things that does is to make horror into an endlessly adaptable genre. And that, I think, is one of the main reasons why it's more popular than ever today, even though it's using figures which in many cases go back centuries. It's able to keep coming up with new variations of those figures, new variations of those tropes that speak to the anxieties of any given time, including our own time.
That's fascinating. I mean, usually I think of this genre as having narrow conventions, you know? So what you're saying is that it is a very adaptive genre. Um, Usually I do associate it with that kind of classic era of the supernatural, but perhaps in some ways what you're suggesting is that because it taps into the myriad and changing nature of people's fears because they're in response to the world, it itself also as a genre, as a form of expression of culture, has come to represent and portray a greater range than we might think of in this kind of classic narrow supernatural. I mean, that's an interesting kind of suggestion and point. And if it started in some sense, as many scholars you were alluding to argue that it was escapist in some ways from the unpleasant and difficult and trying and economically dislocating and socially dislocating circumstances of the Great Depression, for example. How might we track the evolution of the genre that you're saying has embraced kind of wider and wider kinds of forms, with what has been happening in the world? How might we relate horror, fact, and fiction?
Well, a couple of things to say by way of preface to answering that question. One is to point out that any popular cultural form, any popular cultural genre, in order to last, in order to be around for a long time, has to be able to balance successfully two things. And the first of those is tradition, and the second is innovation. And you have to be able to produce products that contain enough familiar elements that they resonate with the consumer. They understand what it is that they're consuming. So there's that almost ritualistic pleasure of consuming something that's recognizable. But at the same time, there has to be enough variation that they're also being entertained by something that's novel. If you have too much of one or too much of the other, it's not going to work. And I think horror has found that perfect balance between tradition and innovation. The other thing I would say, just as a general point, is that the other important feature of pop culture, media, and genres to bear in mind is their incredible hybridity. I'm not at all sure that there is such a thing as a pure genre, period. But I will say that I think horror is probably one of the most hybrid genres out there and has been since its beginning. And I think it's that hybridity that is another key to its success. So if you wanted to sort of take, for sake of argument, those monster movies of the 1930s, I would actually sort of push it back a little bit more, because there's a lot of debate, as you can imagine, about what the first horror film is. But many people would go for The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1919. And there you have a great example of a film that can and has often been read as an allegory of the situation in post-war First World War. The movie was produced by two pacifists, one of whom was forced to serve in the war, the other of whom was able to avoid service. And you can see encoded into that movie a great deal of skepticism and mistrust about authority that is personified in the character of Dr. Caligari. So right from the beginning of the film version of the horror genre, you can see the potential for social commentary of a kind being enacted in the genre. Now, with that said, this figure of allegory as the main way in which horror media does its social commentary work, I feel has to be treated with a little bit of caution. And the reason for that, and I speak now as someone who's teaching that horror film class, as you mentioned, the film or the book or whatever it happens to be has to work even if the consumer has absolutely no knowledge of that subtext. In other words, if Cabinet of Dr. Caligari depended upon the viewer's knowledge of the events of World War I and their impact on the director, it would not work as well as it does. So allegory can be very useful to understanding how horror media does it work, but it's not sufficient. It's not the only thing we need. But if we were to go on from there, I would say that we could also look at a film like Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956, which is often described as being the sort of perfect reflection of Cold War anxiety during the Red Scare. And the pod people represent American fears at the time of communist infiltration and the way that we were all going to be turned into these sort of passive subjects devoid of human emotions, controlled by a central authority. But the other thing that's interesting about that film is that it demonstrates that the ideological content of these films, even if read in an allegorical manner, is not necessarily singular. Because, of course, there's another reading of that film that is equally plausible, which is that the focus of the critique in that film is not the communists, it's the Americans. And really what's being targeted is this drive toward conformity in 1950s America. And anyone who steps outside of that is going to become persona non grata and excluded from the community. So again, you can produce an allegorical reading of any one of these particular media, but it doesn't mean it's the only one, and it doesn't mean that it's the definitive one.
Right. It sounds like in that sense, because I was thinking about allegory, by using the supernatural or a very fantastical framework, it creates the distance through which an allegory can be read against it. But there may be different allegories, right? So this is both of those could be allegorical readings of the invasion of the body snatchers, but they are in some sense diametrically opposed in terms of the political consequences of those interpretations. And so that's kind of an interesting thing to consider in terms of the function or what horror does. Like, there's one way in which literary critics might study this as an allegorical kind of commentary on the conditions during the period when the movie was made. But there's something else, which is that how is it experienced, and what are the kinds of I guess political consequences or outcomes for an audience that experiences these films. What thoughts you have about that?
Well, there's a couple of things about this. First of all, just to sort of finish up that thought about Caligari and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you mentioned a frame. Both of those films happen to be framed narratives. Both of them have the events of the film, most of the events, told in the form of a flashback in the middle of the framing device in the film. And the interesting thing about the use of that technique is that it's partly there to impose a degree of closure on the narrative that, in a sense, tries to sort of limit the radicalism of that narrative. Both the directors in both films objected vehemently to having a framing device imposed on their film because they felt that the resolution just didn't work for them. And this raises, I think, a more general question as to whether horror narratives are more effective when they're left open-ended, as opposed to a nice, tidy resolution of one kind or another. But with respect to audience, I do think that's a very significant change that's taken place over the last, well, in particular, say 20, 30 years. Because if you think back to Walter Benjamin's work on film, one of the things that he felt gave the medium revolutionary potential was precisely the fact that it's consumed in a group. And it can be an important medium for helping to form and influence group identity in that respect. In the age of streaming and the internet, that's no longer necessarily true. I mean, I've seen Jordan Peele's Get Out both in a movie theater and in my laptop, and the two experiences are completely different from each other. So yeah, I think audience, and especially the difference between people who are going to the sort of multiplex and people who are watching quote unquote art house horror, is another thing that we need to think about. The audience for horror film, just like for any other form of popular culture, is extremely diverse in terms of both class and sexuality and race and gender and so on. And that also, I think, influences how the medium is consumed. I'll give one other example of this, and this is a good way, I think, of sort of tracking how the medium has changed over the years. And it's a big subject to take on, so I'll try to be brief. And that is the way in which horror film, horror media has represented race. If you go back again to the sort of early decades of Hollywood, it won't surprise you to hear that, first of all, there's very, very little representation of people of color at all. And when it does appear, it's really problematic, also unsurprising. And the way to bring this into focus, I think, is to look at the history of the zombie film in particular. And as you may be aware, that, you know, looking back to the 30s and the 40s, with films like White Zombie and I Walked with a Zombie, you have the figure of the zombie identified almost exclusively with voodoo and with Haiti and the Caribbean more generally. Now, there are still some very, very interesting aspects to those films. For example, White Zombie has what I think of as a really kind of fascinating proto-Marxist representation of zombified labor that could be taken almost literally out of Capital in some ways. But in other respects, you know, the films are sort of deeply problematic. Now, if you then sort of fast forward to the 1970s and the era of the so-called blaxploitation movie, that's when you have the appearance of high camp films like Blackula that sort of reinterpret the figure of the vampire for a white audience, but for a black audience rather, but which were also very popular with white audiences. And if you fast forward again, obviously a film I just mentioned, Jordan Peele's Get Out, was a game changer in the sense of elevating and changing the representation of race and racism in the horror genre. And other filmmakers have just sort of picked up that idea and run with it ever since. So this is an illustration of what I was referring to earlier about that incredible sort of fertility of the horror genre to keep taking up the same subject, but at different periods of time. And each time you get a different treatment of that subject because the genre is so in tune with the changes that are taking place in the society of which it's a part.
There are two different avenues. I can't decide which of the fascinating points you just made to really go down. Hopefully we'll get to both of them, but just the, you know, kind of zombified labor and, you know, kind of the points that you might make about a kind of political economic sort of interpretation of those kinds of images of horror. Firstly, it just reminds me so much that, which struck me when I was reading, you know, Das Kapital for the first time, is how frequently Marx himself talks about vampires, talks about themes and motifs that come from, you know, horror sorts of Gothic imagery, and in just trying to describe the way in which capitalism as a set of forces that are not directly apprehensible because of its systemic abstraction of labor. He tried to find vivid images to really portray the, you know, the bloody jaws dripping with blood from labor, you know, talking about vampires, talking about zombies, about monsters, you know, in order to try and communicate some sense of the horror of the system of reality, you know. So that's an interesting kind of relationship between the allegorical language of horror in relation to, actual horrors that are hard to describe otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that personally, I've never really been able to decide whether it was my interest in crime narratives and horror narratives that helped to make me a Marxist, or the other way around. Which is to say that there's definitely a sort of synergy between those things. And the other thing that occurs to me is, and again, I don't want to dismiss this anxiety because it is a very pertinent one. For example, if we think about the current situation in Gaza and what the future is going to hold, I can understand some people having a great deal of hesitation about using the horror genre to narrativize or to make sense of or to process the genocide. But at the same time, I would say that you can look to Das Kapital and to others of Marx's work and say that, for him, the connection was absolutely clear. That reality, in a very profound sense, not a banal sense, is horrific. And in order to sort of, as you say, concretize that perception, the objective correlative of that assertion is with the vampire or the werewolf or whatever it happens to be. Because, of course, that's not just something that characterizes, from Marx's point of view, the pre-capitalist stage of primitive accumulation. It's also something that, characterizes capital accumulation right up until the present. And so from that perspective, horror narratives have a kind of inbuilt relevance. As long as capitalism is around, I would argue, we're going to need horror to be able to understand it, to visualize, to see, to make visceral the damage that it does. And I think that's one of the greatest things that horror narratives can do, is to sort of bring that affective dimension of the horrors of capitalism to the forefront of our consciousness. Because we all understand that on an abstract level, but it's the profoundly effective nature of film as a medium, and of horror film in particular, that I think can really allow it to work on a level alongside the brain, that when you're experiencing this in the body of the viewer as well, it gives it a completely different valence.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, so many interesting avenues to explore in this. It's such a rich vein, of culture and of political and economic analysis. But I wanted to come back to the question about racial violence,
Yeah.
about a kind of settler colonial world built upon plantation slavery, and the way in which that context may have informed the kinds of fears and anxieties of suppressed violence. Because it seems to me that's one thing that you were just talking about, is the way in which forms of violence that can either be abstract or hidden can be surfaced through the genre of horror. And yet, at the same time, there is an occlusion because of using the supernatural imagery. One could see it as just a story about mythic folk kind of terrors that, drawn from this deep kind of past about demons and vampires, the undead, etc. Those more very elemental kind of fears that developed and drove the popular cultural folkloric mythologies. But yet at the same time, by surfacing them even in that kind of deflected way, it taps into something. And it seemed to me that when you were talking about, the kind of voodoo, fears about voodoo, and using that as a thematic, that it clearly is responding in some ways to the crimes and the horrors of the slave trade, the plantation slavery. These are kind of deep seated, in the kind of culture in the New World, in the hemisphere, these settler colonial. And so you might go in a couple of different directions here, both about the racial kind of regime and how horror And whether blaxploitation, this is a kind of interesting thing. It's like, what is the work, you might say, in contrast, or I don't know, is it a contrast or not, between the early zombie kind of horror movies that might have been a response in some ways to the legacies of slavery and a racial regime in
Yep.
patterning forms of fear. And then in kind of popular later culture where you have a lot of Black actors and in the blaxploitation horror movies, is something different happening there that is a contrast or is a commentary. So that's one kind of direction I wonder about the genre. What would your analysis of that be?
Boy, there's a lot there, and there's a lot of things to say. First of all, I think it's important to go back for a moment to this idea of the hybridity of the genre. And I am one of those people that doesn't have a great deal of interest in policing the boundaries of a genre. In fact, I tend to sort of go in the other direction and extend the genre into territory where it may have no business going, but to do it as a kind of provocation. So, for example, I think it's very interesting to assert that the documentary No Other Land is a horror movie. I think it's interesting to assert that Toni Morrison's Beloved is a horror novel. Because if it's not, then what is it? It's clearly aligned with the things that you've just been talking about in Morrison's case. But the other thing I would say is that there are some examples where the allegorical frame doesn't really apply because the engagement with racial issues is so much more explicit. So, for example, you can draw a comparison between George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which has again come to have this canonical status due largely, or at least significantly, to the casting of Dwayne Jones as the protagonist Ben. Obviously extremely unusual at the time to have a Black man in the lead actor role in a film of this kind, and especially one that within, the story world of the film takes on this active dominant role. Now, Romero has famously said that Jones's race had absolutely nothing to do with his casting in that role. He simply gave the best audition. So here's a good example of where, auteur theory, and the argument that the director is in control of the meaning of the film runs up against a very real limit, because you don't have to sort of read that film against the grain to extract that racial subtext from it, especially when you consider the fact that literally when they had finished filming Night of the Living Dead, they were driving from the filming location to New York City with a cut in the film in the back of the car to try and find someone to screen the film when they heard the news of Martin Luther King's assassination over the radio. So given that kind of context, how could you possibly avoid that kind of reading of Night of the Living Dead? Now, there's more to say about that film, but I would contrast that, let's say, with a film like Candyman. Both the original in 1992 and Nia DaCosta's remake 3 or 4 years ago, where the engagement with issues of Black on Black crime, with urban racism, with gentrification is much, much more explicit. There is no sort of reading between the lines needed. And I think that is one of the main changes that has taken place.
Yeah. I just want to, there was a useful question that had also occurred to me, but it came up in the chat here. Haile Sela, what's the etymological relationship between horror and terror? Horrific and terrific. I don't know if the terrific fits, but it also is a question that I had quite apart from just this etymological kind of element, but wondering if fear and horror are to be distinguished. Like, there are things that can scare you in various ways. There are different kinds of fears, but we call it the horror genre. And I'm wondering if that sense of being appalled and I don't know if it also involves being disgusted, or, what is horror? Is it the same as fear and terror?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
could you
again, when
yeah,
it comes to these definitions, it's kind of a moving target. I mean,
yeah.
interestingly, this distinction between terror and horror, or discussion of that distinction, goes all the way back to the Gothic period and with Anne Radcliffe. She tries to distinguish between those two, and the distinction she comes up with is essentially terror is the emotion you feel when the terrifying event is actually taking place, when you're in the middle of it. Whereas horror is the feeling that you get after that terrifying event has concluded. So there's something almost sort of post-factual about the feeling of horror. And perhaps if we can sort of read into that a little more, a sort of analytical element that is not necessarily there in terror, where the emphasis is just on being so overwhelmed that those analytical qualities cannot be brought into play. One way of thinking about this is that, I mean, this just occurs to me, I don't know if this would actually hold up, but one way of thinking of this distinction is that when we look at the screen and look at what these characters are going through, they're going through a terrifying experience. We're going through a horrifying experience. I don't know if that's a useful distinction, but maybe horror implies a little more distance than terror does.
That's interesting. So I wonder if, if that holds up. I mean, if that's a useful analytic. I mean, it makes me think and consider something that you had mentioned a little bit before about, the appropriateness, or how one will consider using and engaging the horror film and horror motifs in the context of the Gaza genocide, but
Yeah.
that it is a little bit like also Palestinians are undergoing the terror of a genocidal, colonial violence being visited upon them. And for all of us who have been witnessing and experiencing at some remove, are experiencing the horror of
Yeah.
watching a genocide unfold. And that kind of made me think, in sort of the same way. I don't know if these are parallel or if it's useful, but it just recalled to me, Theodore Adorno's kind of remark, much discussed, debated, and often perhaps misapplied, but that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. Is similarly, what would it mean for to make fictional horror when we have been experiencing, watching horror on social media during the time of a genocide?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, again, very important question, very big question. I would sort of subdivide it a little bit into, first of all, to think of this as a strategic issue, and then secondly, to think of it as an ethical/moral issue, which is not to say that those two things can ever be neatly detached, but if they can be disarticulated momentarily, it might bring some other things into focus. So, for example, whether we like it or not, horror, the concept of horror, has become the lingua franca by which we talk about and have exchanges with other people about what's happening in Gaza, for example. And, just recently I saw an article whose headline was, Gaza looks like something out of a horror movie, or Gaza looks like something even worse than a horror movie. Now, of course, what you risk there is the trivialization of what's happening by comparing it to a fictional product on the screen. However, that you could argue that problem can be outweighed by the strategic benefit of translating what is happening in Gaza into a register that is going to resonate with as many people as possible, right? Now, if you were to prioritize, by contrast, this sort of ethical, moral issue, you would have a much, much higher level of caution, I think, about going down that path. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not necessarily suggesting that famous kind of like, Brechtian motto of grub first, then ethics. I'm not saying we should always just cast ethics aside and prioritize strategy. But I do think that whether we want it or not, whether we regard it as problematic or not, horror is there as an available language to translate what is happening. The question then becomes, what do we see as the strategic value or lack thereof of using it to narrativize those experiences? There's one other problem that I would just sort of throw into the mix here that I don't have any good answer for, and that is, I think whenever you're producing something that has, if we could put it very bluntly, quote unquote, real historical events as part of a fictional horror narrative, you immediately have the problem of what's going to be foregrounded and what's going to be backgrounded. And we're all familiar with films, not just in the horror genre, but in many other genres as well, where the historical, with a capital H, forms the kind of backdrop against which the main drama, normally between a sort of hetero white couple, gets played out, and everything else is sort of like reduced to the supporting cast. So I prefer to sort of think of this as an opportunity, and that may be a little bit Pollyanna-ish of me, but I do think that to produce horror-inflected narratives of the genocide is potentially a valuable strategic option that's going to require a great deal of thought, but the benefits could be such that it might be worth taking that risk. There's one other thing, I know I keep saying there's one other thing I will add, but there is one other thing I will add. The other thing to bear in mind about this, of course, is that this is not just an aesthetic or a cultural issue, by which I mean that these decisions are not just going to be made on that level. It also is going to be made primarily, one might add, on an institutional and structural level, with the very concrete issue of which projects are going to get funded, which are not going to get funded, and by whom. So, for example, No Other Land, despite winning an Academy Award for Best Documentary, has been unable to find a distributor in the US, and they have just decided to distribute it themselves. Mubi was the only service interested in streaming it, and negotiations broke down because of Mubi's link with Sequoia Capital that has links to the Israeli military. So that deal fell through. So it's extremely unusual that they would do the streaming arrangements themselves, but they felt that they literally had no other option. Now, on the flip side, finally, thanks to a company called Watermelon Pictures, we're going to get a Palestinian horror film called The Visitor that's going to be filmed in Jordan next year. And that's incredible news. And I can't wait to sort of see the film and see what they do with that. But obviously, we need many, many, many more companies like Watermelon Pictures before we can even sort of begin, in a sense, having a conversation about the ethics of representation. Do you see what I mean? I mean, I'm overstating my case. I don't mean before we can have that conversation, but the ethics discussion, to me, is sort of dependent to some extent on those institutional factors that often don't get the attention that they need.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, this is very interesting. I think an important point. Before I pick up on, what we might envision the possible use of the horror motif and horror genre in the context of, this Palestinian film and what resonances it might have with indigenous horror, which is what I want to ask you about in a moment. I just want to say it's been great to follow people in the chat. I want to say, if you haven't liked the stream yet, please do like it so that others may get it on their feeds and breakthrough in the algorithm. I mean, this is a fantastic discussion. We are just so lucky to have David with us, giving all kinds of fascinating insights and analysis of, horror films. Make sure other people hear about it. So you could also share this on social media. You could post it on X, on Instagram, Facebook, etc. Whatever your social media platforms. Share the stream so that more people can come and join the discussion. And if you are watching on X, actually, I think X is the only other platform I'm streaming this on. You can retweet it, but you can also come into the YouTube chat so that we can actually have you as part of the discussion. You can pose your questions and comments that I'll try to highlight on the screen here. So again, please do share this so that others can, benefit from this wonderful conversation that we're having. Okay, back to you suggested looking at some articles, and also I posted at your suggestion trailer for a film called Blood Quantum, and it was news to me to realize that there is a thriving kind of subgenre, if you want to put it that way, of indigenous horror that really picks up on very interesting themes about how to use horror in ways to surface indigenous struggles, and actually to create a relationship between reality and history on the one hand, and this kind of use of the fictional genre to meditate upon the actual continuing horror and reality of daily experience in settler colonial society. What's going on with this fascinating genre? What do you think it can do? And is this a model that you might see being able to use to talk about the Gaza genocide in an effective, strategic way? That you've mentioned that there could be strategies in using horror films.
I think very much so, but obviously, as with every other situation like this, it depends on who's telling the stories and under what circumstances they're allowed to tell these stories. But I do think that the rise of indigenous horror narratives is one of the most interesting developments in the field over the last, say, 10 or 15 years. With regard to fiction, one of my favorite writers who's writing in the field today is a guy called Stephen Graham Jones, a member of the Blackfeet Nation. And he's written novels like The Only Good Indians that do a really, really amazing job of working with Native American history and folklore and combining them with more traditional elements of what people would recognize as mainstream horror fiction to produce this kind of genre mashup that has had like a really revolutionary impact. There's also a Mexican-Canadian writer called Silvia Moreno Garcia. In her novel, Mexican Gothic, she's doing something kind of interesting in a related field with eugenics. That's her particular interest in that novel. But I also came across some academic work recently that very interestingly suggests that horror is the perfect vehicle or genre with which to address settler colonialism. And they talk in particular about the well-worn trope of the Indian burial ground that you can find, all over the place. I mean, probably the examples that most people will know are in Tobe Hooper's movie Poltergeist, and also in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. And this critic points out that remarkably on one level, but not surprisingly on another level, the trope of the Indian burial ground gets used in such a way that white people become the victims. Like how this actually is accomplished, it seems incredibly, counterintuitive. But you could argue that yes, there is a representation of Native American culture, but my goodness, like what an incredibly constrained one, and one that's just used to sort of shore up the victimized status of the white protagonists. But they make the very, very interesting argument that more broadly, the violence that takes place in, let's say, slasher movies like the Halloween franchise or the Friday the 13th franchise, are, in a sense, white settler fears about being subjected to the same kind of violence that indigenous populations were subjected to when the settlers arrived. So this violence that seemingly comes out of nowhere and is seemingly sort of unmotivated and can devastate entire groups of people in a very short period. Again, you don't have to read between the lines so much to sort of see the kind of parallels. Now, the argument is that these are parallels that are not registering with the audience at the Cineplex, but which are nevertheless are there underneath the surface. Now, that is a little different from other movies that draw upon indigenous history and culture, like Blood Quantum, and like another very interesting movie filmed in Nunavut a few years ago called Slashback. In the case of Blood Quantum, obviously the title refers to that racist doctrine of how to establish, Native American identity. But the premise is pure genius, which is that there is some kind of like a zombie pandemic outbreak, and the only people who are immune are the local indigenous population. So the res now gets transformed into the only safe place in the world. And the basic conflict of the film is a disagreement between tribal members about whether or not they're going to give shelter to white people who are as yet uninfected. And so it's a great reversal, but also a sort of callback to what happened to native populations when the first settlers arrived. But it has a kind of tragic outcome in the sense that the divisions within the community on the res become so intense that the community breaks apart and pretty much everyone gets killed. But again, I would argue that this is one point of continuity between a film like Blood Quantum and, say, Night of the Living Dead, because anyone who's seen the Romero film will know, and again, this seems kind of counterintuitive, that most of the audience's attention is not placed on the zombies. They're kind of there in the background, shuffling around, doing their thing. What Romero is really interested in is what's taking place inside the house with the humans who have not yet been infected. There we get this kind of petri dish under which generational differences come under the microscope, racial differences come under the microscope, tensions within the traditional normative family structure come under the microscope. And it's their inability of these people to work together which dooms them. And that's essentially the same thing that happens in Blood Quantum. So I would say I would connect with this with a sort of larger point, which is that in zombie films in particular, the message is that the problem is not with the zombies, it's with us. We're the ones that are going to sort of destroy each other. And unless we can find a way to sort of work together against that monster, then we're all doomed.
Right. So that is another case of using some either supernatural or natural kind of phenomenon, as the basis for some kind of warning or critique that there needs to be some kind of social change or reform. And so that kind of reminds me, I want to talk also about the value of ghost stories, and the fact of, the way this is a kind of way of dealing with and processing and commenting on history, and the fact that this is clearly relevant for settler colonial consciousness that tries to suppress the kind of founding traumas of violence, and how this same kind of motif of dealing with basically mediating across history is important in a set of horror films set in Latin America or that dealt with human rights abuses in Latin America, whether it's Guatemala or other places. You posted an article about that, so maybe we can talk about that. But then I'll want to move to, talking about eco horror.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to say about this. This is one of those instances where I think it's helpful to sort of move outside the Euro-American context, because if you look, for example, at horror narratives, especially in Japan, where a lot of traditional folkloric elements in Japanese ghost stories are about the dead seeking justice for a wrong that has been done to them, or a promise that was made to them that has not been kept. So justice is a concept which is front and center in a lot of these narratives that it isn't necessarily in the things we've been talking about up to this point.
Right.
Now, there still is that sort of sense of the past, again, that has a kind of very Marxist valence of the past as a nightmare weighing upon the brain of the living. But the point is that in a lot of these narratives, the past can be negotiated with, come to terms with, to be resolved if justice is done, if the past is recognized, not as something that is gone, but in William Faulkner's phrase, it's not even past, it's still with us. And I think the film La Llorona is a great example of that as well. There, it's all about justice and accountability. Now, in that case, the past we're dealing with, it's much more recent in relation to the events of the film, but it's equally concerned, and very powerfully concerned, with the responsibility of the collective, whether that collective is the nation, or whether that collective is the group of people that perpetrated these crimes, that they face both individual and collective responsibility for what they did. And of course, this is a debate that is still being played out, quote unquote, in real life in Guatemala at the moment. In fact, just recently, the court case was concluded against ex-members of the military during that period who were convicted of rape. Now, whether or not they'll actually ever face justice in the sense of doing jail time is another question. And one of the most frustrating things is that some of the legal organizations that were supporting the plaintiff's case were being funded by USAID. And since Trump has cut the funds, it's not clear that the legal process is going to go any further in terms of appeals, which is enormously frustrating and unjust. But within the confines of the discussion we're having, that film is a really notable example of how to produce what I would describe as a sort of ethical form of horror narrative that is still extremely chilling and atmospheric. And interestingly enough, I think the same year that the Guatemalan film La Llorona came out, there was a North American film with the very same title that also came out that was awful. It was absolutely awful. And it treated the figure of La Llorona as basically the Latina version of Michael Myers. I mean, that's essentially like what she was. But it was a very, very instructive contrast. In other words, I think part of the reason the virtues of the Guatemalan version were thrown into such sharp relief was because of the release of this awful Hollywoodized version of La Llorona as well. So it was kind of like a happy accident that a truly awful film and a great film happened to be released, at the same time.
I can imagine that's a great assignment for your students to
Yeah,
compare.
exactly.
I can see that being a very useful heuristic, looking at these two uses of the same legendary sources, popular folkloric sources, but how the treatment can lead to such different, both aesthetic and political, kind of consequences and conclusions.
Very much so.
It is, yeah, that's amazing. I did already allude to that. I thought that it's interesting also to think about how nature, much like the supernatural and the natural, that some sort of sense of kind of crisis about over which the framing tries to suggest we don't have that much control, even though, of course, maybe we have a lot more if we actually changed our social processes, our economy, our politics, but that the way of dramatizing the background as the force against which we are being terrorized and threatened by, kind of then foregrounds kind of internal critique. How has the kind of genre of like natural disaster as horror and eco kind of apocalypse and climate crisis come to be thematized in your kind of analysis in comparison, as a kind of horror sort of story?
Yeah.
What's at stake in these kinds of?
Well, let me first of all say, just to repeat a very famous quote that I'll come back to, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And obviously that's relevant here. I'll come back to that. But before I do that, let me just go back to something I said earlier with respect to, broadening the category of horror narrative as far as possible to as a provocation. I would say that a lot of nature documentaries today could be characterized as horror narratives, because that's the emotion I experience when I watch them, and it's not even saved by the presence of David Attenborough, God bless him. I mean, even with David Attenborough, I can't shake this feeling of horror. It sort of reminds me a little bit of pretty much every time I've heard Noam Chomsky speak in public, where we get this sort of this litany of just disaster after disaster after disaster. And we get like an hour and a half of this. And at the end, Professor Chomsky says, but, there's no reason to give up hope. And my reaction is, really?
Yeah.
No, actually, that's kind of the message I took from like 99.9% of everything that you said this morning in this talk. So the reason I mention that is because I think a useful frame for thinking about the approach to, horror's approach to climate change, to ecocide, is to sort of remind ourselves of the debate taking place between, climate despair, climate pessimism on the one hand, and climate hope on the other. And again, it seems to me that this is partly a strategic issue and partly a sort of ethical, moral issue. Now, in terms of how horror narratives treat this, one strand, I think, speaks to our desire to see the entire world destroyed, but most especially humanity. Because we have this, well, you don't have to be too perceptive to perceive this, but we have this perception that we are very much the problem. So if you could just imagine a situation in which humanity is wiped out, that's the precondition for things getting better. And so a lot of ecologically oriented horror tends to fall within that category. They are essentially disaster movies where nature gets its revenge and everyone is wiped out by nature. And it's interesting in that respect to think of a film like M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening, which was completely derided when the film first came out, this notion of homicidal trees and plants. It was just ridiculed. Now it's interesting to sort of see people start to reevaluate that film now that we have a wider canon of ecologically oriented horror movies. The more generous version of that, although actually maybe generous is not the right word, are movies like Gaia and Ben Wheatley's In the Earth, where they begin from a sort of premise of the unavoidable interlinking of the human and the natural that ordinarily the humans involved have ignored, and they ignored to their peril, and they normally come to a sticky end. So perhaps it's not that different from the disaster version of this narrative. It just takes place on a smaller scale. So I think that this particular variant of the horror narrative brings to the fore the issue of the political efficacy of the horror genre. and whether in fact it has political efficacy. Because if all we're going to be able to do with this branch of horror narratives is to enjoy the spectacle of the world burning, and to enjoy the spectacle of our own destruction, that might be interesting from a psychoanalytic point of view, but is not particularly interesting or hopeful from a political point of view. So I think there's still a lot of room for development in this particular area, where we can ideally find a way to both communicate the horrific reality that we're faced with, but at the same time introduce a kind of qualified notion of human agency into the narrative that might be able to suggest that all hope is not lost and there's something that we can do about this. The problem, or rather one of the many problems, is how to do this without simply reinstating that tired old model of the heroic protagonist that's going to be able to triumph against all odds. We don't want to go down that road. But I think that before those kinds of narratives are going to emerge, we still need to make a lot more progress in our discussions about whether there is any basis for hope with respect to climate change, or whether we are past the tipping point. If we are past the tipping point, then you might make the argument that, yes, let's just let everything burn and enjoy the spectacle. But if not, then we have some work to do.
Yeah, indeed. I just want to highlight a couple comments by a colleague and comrade Sasha Rambouts, co-host of Resistance is Fertile podcast. And just to remind people, there is still a petition because YouTube has suppressed that wonderful show that characterizes itself as the psychological support front for the resistance against empire. So do check out their podcast on all the other platforms where it is still available, and also sign up to demand that YouTube reinstate the show. But Sasha mentioned that, and something that I was wondering also is, like, depending on the way in which eco-horror or other, kind of subgenres of horror can kind of inculcate this sort of sense of political passivity, like you can't do anything about it. It's, an impossible force that you're dealing with. And that can also be part of trying to depoliticize, kind of, and demobilize people. And so that, it could be handled in very different ways. And of course, a lot of times, perhaps one of the ways in which, maybe blockbuster or Hollywood type films, treat these kinds of material and use the genre of horror is in politically disabling ways, which is why it's interesting to see the different locations globally where, the kind of demand for justice and using the ghost story that you talked about in, both in the Latin American, but also in the Japanese, kind of context. Those are more politically enabling. Because if you actually solve the problem and get rid of the injustice and repair, do reparations to make up, then the ghosts will, be satisfied, right? So there are different ways in which the horror genre, as such an elastic and plastic form, can be politically beneficial. But when it comes to the ecocide horrors, eco horror, I guess I would just also kind of go back to this other comment, and also a previous episode that I had on Office Hours with Jason W. Moore, a kind of environmental historian, which is that the way of kind of, nature getting its revenge on us terrible humans for the harm that we've done, which fits into that kind of formula, is also kind of misemphasizing in a way the kind of analysis that says it's the capitalocene. So it's not humanity, it's not the Anthropocene, it's the capitalocene, right? And so we want to find ways, perhaps, just as you're saying, you don't want just the sort of kind of hero, we have to find narratives within this kind of a convention that could deal with the horror, but actually politically enable the hope that you were sort of talking about. And I'm wondering, how might one envision that, and what resources do we have, in our analysis and in our kind of narrative conventions to try and be politically enabling in the face of the environmental devastation humans have been causing because of capitalism,
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, rightly or wrongly, I come at this from the point of view of having spent, my professional life as an educator. And from that perspective, I tend to see whatever it is that I'm working with in the classroom as the raw material. It's not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of the conversation. And the reason I emphasize that is that I think part of the reason we may feel this sense of despair and passivity is that we have become so inculcated into this idea that all we do is watch or read this product and then that's it, that becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. If, however, you start from the premise that your consumption of a particular film or a particular book, a particular narrative, is the beginning of the process that's going to go out beyond that act of consumption, then I think immediately a different set of questions, a different set of possibilities come up. And I'm sure you've had the same experience down in the classroom, that, and I find in particular with horror film, it's an incredibly useful gateway to get the students to think about and talk about issues that if you were to approach them in a more direct way, they would shut down. They would say, well, I'm not a political person. I'm not particularly interested in talking about that. I don't know anything about environmentalism. I don't know anything about Black history or whatever it happens to be. But through the lens of the films that we talk about in the classes that I teach, they find themselves having these discussions without even being aware of it on some level until the discussions are over. So I hate to sound too Pollyanna-ish, but I do think that we need to sort of stop thinking in terms of the limitations of the product as if we have to internalize those limitations, and instead to sort of think about the product as the beginning of a process of dialogue, of conversation, of community building that takes those products as the raw material and then runs with them.
Yeah. Okay. I think a lot to consider and think there and learn from. I just wanted to point out that, connecting our horrors, horror facts, is genocide in Gaza, climate crisis. Somebody put in Ode to John Trudell put into the chat. It's as if the genocide in Gaza is our testing ground for uniting for effective action, preparing us for climate crisis. And this is something that I've been thinking about, is that if we cannot, use the moment of the horror that, we are witnessing in a genocide, something that actually could be stopped politically, we're missing an opportunity to build the kinds of collective structures and solidarities and techniques that we will need desperately in order to confront the climate crisis and maintain, the politics of hope in an effective sort of way. And so, these are all connected, it seems to me. They're horrors, and there are horrors that we have to learn how to both aesthetically, culturally, and politically, organize around to confront. So this is a very useful kind of set of suggestions that you had there, I think.
Well, to some extent, we go back here to that distinction we were talking about earlier between terror and horror. And again, if we were to sort of like revisit that distinction, we might say that, what we're trying to do is to sort of move from a state of terror into a state of horror. And that would be enough to be going on with for the time being. In other words, to sort of move from a stage that is characterized by paralysis, helplessness, feeling overwhelmed, to something that is more analytical, that gives us something more to work with. Because I do think that there's something to the distinction in that sense. But I think that it sounds again like a counterintuitive thing to say, but I do think that horror can be, if not an enabling condition, at least an enabling precondition.
Hmm.
Because if you lose the capacity to feel horror, then you're really in trouble. And so I think as long as we're still able to perceive something as horrific, that's one of the most important preconditions to beginning to change that thing.
Yeah, yeah. I think, this is an interesting point to think about the different valences of emotional states and the politics that flow from them. And so I think you're right. Maybe that distinction is really worth maintaining, because it seems analytically to have been helpful, at least a couple of times already in the discussion. So that's something to consider, keep thinking about that. I did want to, because you had mentioned, um, in the case of the indigenous horror film Blood Quantum, a number of levels and layers through which it was responding to settler colonial fears and culture, and how should indigenous, um, you know, uh, responses be kind of thought through, and in fact even moral kinds of questions about what are the obligations of the indigenous people to turn that, now that they can turn the tables, how should they deal with this kind of virus that is spreading. That was fascinating, but it also reminded me is that um, pandemics are also another kind of motif through which, or matter for horror expression. And there was an interesting article that you had also suggested that we consider thinking about, which is, how COVID-19 may be the next inspiration for, uh, you know, and I don't know if it actually really has. I mean, that's an interesting, this was written, kind of close to the time when people were in the midst of the terror, right? Experiencing the terror and fear of the pandemic. And because they were experiencing and feeling that, there was this piece, suggesting that, uh, it'll become a kind of material for a horror film. And I'm wondering if it actually really has been the case, and what you think about that kind of
Yeah,
issue.
I think the jury's still out on that one, to be honest. It's a little too early to say. Let me just go back for a moment, if I could, Adnan, to something you were saying just a moment ago, because the other thing I think is relevant here, that with the example of indigenous horror in mind, one of the things that happens in Blood Quantum is that it raises the possibility of horror not as a state of exception, but as everyday life. And that, I think, is one of the characteristics of the indigenous perspectives on horror. Because within the example of Blood Quantum in particular, when society breaks down because of the pandemic, because of the zombie virus, it actually takes people on the res a few days to sort of register this fact, because to them it just feels like normality. It's like, oh, what? The electricity's gone out. We have no internet signal. That's just called a Tuesday on the res, So there's this distinction between, how can I put it, almost like the temporality of the horrific. Is it something that you experience on a daily basis, or do you experience it as a catastrophic disruption? And that, I think, is a useful thing to think about, because catastrophe is a word with like multiple meanings and multiple valences, and will not mean the same thing to every community. Now, with reference to the pandemic, I think you can apply that sort of same kind of idea, and how quickly can the sort of state of exception become the new normal. And I think that that is what the horror film, or the horror narrative's reaction to the pandemic, is still trying to sort out, because we all know that, there was this sort of collective determination to ignore the pandemic, to hope that it went away. And as soon as, there was some evidence that the virus was beginning to recede, it was almost like this collective act of disavowal that had ever taken place in the first place, and that we were going to go back to, quote unquote, the normal. Now, we know, of course, on another disavowed level that that's not going to happen, and that what we think of as the normal is very different from what normal was before 2020. And maybe horror can give us a way of exploring that kind of disconnect. However, I would say that if we were to look at the evidence of films like We're All Going to the World's Fair, or to I Saw the TV Glow, it's again too early to say this, but my sense is that horror characterized by the pandemic or influenced by the pandemic is going to focus not so much on the disaster-sized impact upon the social whole, upon the social totality, but rather upon individuals' sense of identity, and in particular, how that identity is being influenced by the lives that we live online. That's what I see in I Saw the TV Glow and We're All Going to the World's Fair. And I think I don't necessarily have a problem with that emphasis. To me, if there's a potential problem, it's that it gets a little too close to that very narrow, individualized understanding of identity politics that almost turns isolation into a fetish, and identity construction into an individualized act, rather than something that's taken place within a much larger context. But that, I think, is a problem that, you know, all media faces to a greater or lesser extent. And again, Jameson is useful on this point. Like, you know, how do we overcome and can we overcome the difficulties of representing the social totality? Or are we just doomed to, you know, being able to represent a little piece of it that we're particularly interested in, and find creative ways to suggest how that can stand in for the whole?
Interesting. Your remarks there also made me think, in terms of the temporality or the normalcy, that horror as the exception.
Right.
That is maybe, in some sense, a kind of narrative convention that has to rely upon a kind of privileged sense of normalcy being
Very much.
tolerable. And so the kinds of films and, horror works that might play upon that might, it seems to me, perhaps fall more into the escapist kind of mode, because it's a way of processing, the occasions by, when terror and fear might be experienced, as opposed to the way the indigenous and some of the, maybe more interesting disaster kind of like narratives might frame how this is an opening onto the actual reality that is always terrible and horrible, and that, opens up space politically to, try and confront that on a more systemic sort of level.
Yeah, there are two resources here that won't necessarily solve the problem you're pointing to it down, but which I do think help to bring it into focus. And one of those is Slavoj Žižek's work in Violence, Six Sideways Reflections, and in particular his notion of objective violence, which he describes as the violence that underpins the social order and assures its normal everyday functioning, but the kind of violence that is typically invisible. We have to sort of consciously work to bring it into visibility. And then the other one would be Rob Nixon's work on slow violence, environmental degradation, because there, I think what we're faced with in both cases is the problem of the tendency to spectacularize violence, especially, one could argue, in horror narratives, in order precisely to make them both visible to an audience and to give them impact on an audience. So the challenge in that sense is that how can you possibly represent something like objective violence, which is a little bit like Poe's purloined lesser. It's right in front of us, but we can't see it. Or how do you represent a process of environmental destruction that can take decades or even centuries to unfold, and to do that within a 2-hour horror movie. So these are sort of representational dilemma that need to be, we need to find a way to address them, because if we can do so successfully, then that brings things into our vision and enables us to discuss them in ways that we can't necessarily do right now.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, really wonderful resources and ways to think through this. We're coming close to the end of our time, so I want to first remind everybody to like the stream, before we conclude, and still share it, because even if newcomers to the conversation can't participate in it live, they still will benefit, I think, a great deal from the insights and the discussion, and hopefully have access to your comments in the chat. So do share it on social media. But I wanted to just sort of see if you had, David, any kind of final, sorts of reflections about this theme that we've been discussing, and also, I want to end on, more of a hopeful note. So I noted that in a social media post, you mentioned that, yes, we're going to be talking about all these heavy things about imperialism, about capitalism, about settler colonialism and genocide, but that you still hope that we might, benefit from the resources of hope. And you were channeling, I think, in that your favorite, and I think just absolutely wonderful literary, scholar, Marxist Raymond Williams. So maybe you have some things that you can leave us with.
I've used the phrase counterintuitive quite a bit tonight, so I have to admit that my understanding of what constitutes a resource of hope is somewhat counterintuitive. And one part of that is that horror narratives enable us to know our enemy. And that's not necessarily something we think of as being hopeful, but it is, to me, an essential precondition for change. And so as such, I would put it under that category of being a resource of hope. Know your enemy, know who we're fighting against, know who and what we're up against before we do anything else. The second one relates to a concept I've used in my previous work on crime fiction, and that is that horror narratives at their best can give us a sense of our own complicity in what's being analyzed and represented. Now, for me, a fascinating and, to this point, unanswered question, and maybe unanswerable question, is the political efficacy of complicity, or of an awareness of our complicity. Because again, it seems to me to be a precondition for engagement, a precondition for change. But I'm also aware of how profoundly contradictory it sounds to say an awareness of our complicity in systems of oppression can be part of hope. But I do believe it is. And I think that horror film and horror narratives, by bringing our attention to that fact, can give us a beginning, a way in to exploring our own complicity in a way that's not self-abnegating or self-defeating or just where we beat ourselves up, but that we have a clear-eyed understanding of where we are, what the work is that we have to do, and then we can get on with that work.
Absolutely. I share your confidence that it can contribute. In fact, it must be a precondition. It's why we're educators. It's why we're doing these kinds of discussions publicly to share with people, because, whether it's vain or not, this is what we think we can do. And I do believe that it is, it does have political potential, and it is a requirement, for kind of future collective action. We have to prepare for that. And I also need to note that I think that what you were just ending on about crime and complicity as following from our discussion on horror is a wonderful, perhaps, teaser for a future conversation that I hope you would be willing to come back for, particularly since so many people in the chat are saying, yes, more episodes with Professor Schmid, and ode to John Trudell said, we need another episode of this with Schmid, please. So, the people are demanding more, and I think that might make another great conversation to advance politically where one might go. This one was about recognizing and understanding the horror, fact, and fiction in this time of genocide, ecocide, capitalism, imperialism. But maybe there might be productive avenues to consider and build upon when we think of undoing the politics of the state, of really thinking about how we can get beyond complicity to effective reparative collective political action. So that would be great to come back and discuss that.
That sounds great.
Okay. All right, excellent. Well, you got it there, listeners and watchers. We have a commitment that Professor David Schmid will rejoin us at some point for continuing conversation about relating culture to politics, and really thinking through, how to analyze what we're processing in reality and in fiction, literature, film. These cultural productions. And so I want to thank again Professor David Schmid, who is a professor of English at State University of New York in Buffalo, and is the author of Natural Born Celebrities. And of special relevance to today's discussion, you can check out a collection that he edited and put together with the participation of other colleagues and scholars on zombie talk, that deals with politics and culture, and maybe to allude to of the future discussion, also a collection on crime and the state. So again, I want to thank you so much, David, for a wonderful discussion. Look forward to talking with you again soon. And I want to thank everybody in the chat who's been participating and making excellent kind of suggestions, comments. We couldn't get to all of the particular films or works of literature that you wanted us to discuss, because there's so much. It's a very wide-ranging genre, but I hope you've enjoyed and benefited from the discussion of the examples, and more broadly about the politics of this genre of horror in a time of horror. So I want to thank everybody and wish you well, peace to everyone with justice and solidarity. Until next time, we'll be back next Friday with another office hours. So we hope to see you again there and continue building this community of learning and action. All the best, everyone. Take care. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.